study was done to increase the frequency of verbalizations of a 4-year-old child from a disadvantaged community in a preschool setting. The study looks to determine what the controlling variables in the teacher-child interaction are that increases behavior. The study also assesses the content of verbalizations in relation to changes in the frequency of said verbalizations. The study uses an alternating treatment design, A, B, C, B, D, B. This study examines the use of adult social reinforcement, attention, and access to tangible items contingent on a child's verbalizations. During treatment conditions B and D, attention was given by the teacher immediately and contingent on the child's verbalizations. The only difference between the two conditions were in condition B, in order for the child to gain access to requested materials, the child needed to respond to the teacher's follow-up questions related to the child's initial request. The more questions that the teacher could come up with on the same topic, she would ask the child, which would get the child verbalizing more. So if the child was doing a craft and asked for scissors, for example, the teacher would continue to ask questions related to the topic of other materials that the child may also need. Increases in the child's frequency of verbalizations was seen throughout both conditions. Greater increases and an upward trend was observed during condition B. Authors needed to determine whether or not teachers' attention alone or presenting attention immediately following the child's verbalization was responsible for the higher frequency of verbalizations. In phase C, teacher attention contingent on non-verbalizations was used with differential reinforcement of other behavior. Results of this phase showed an immediate decrease in the frequency of verbalizations made by the child. What was observed during the study was the majority of the child's verbalizations were demands for materials. This indicates that the teacher's attention per se did not maintain the child's increased verbalizations. Instead, access to materials which accompanied the teacher's attention appeared to be the maintaining feature.
During this part of the presentation, I'm going to touch on the independent and dependent variables of the study, as well as the data collection procedures and inter-observer agreement. The independent variable that was used was teacher attention, which was contingent upon the verbalizations of the child. Attention was given in several forms depending on the context of the verbalization made by the child. Some forms included praising, asking the child questions, giving the child equipment, assisting the child, attending to, talking to, and providing a requested object or material to the child. When the child requested a material, the teacher would follow up by asking 1 to 3 questions about the material before providing it to the child. The dependent variable was frequency of verbalizations, which was the percent of verbalizations during a sample period of 5 minutes using intervals of 10 seconds, and they collected the data using whole interval time sampling. Verbalizations are defined in this study as any part of speech that can be heard by the observer, and it does not include laughing, shrieking, or humming. Another dependent variable was the content of verbalizations. This looked at the type of speech being used, for example, nouns and verbs, and how it is being used, i.e. in the form of mans or non-mans. They also looked at how many words the subject was repeating. During the 3-hour preschool day, 3 different observers, which remained the same throughout the study, measured the child's behavior during free play periods, which occurred 2 times a day and were about 45 minutes long. The observers used stopwatches to time intervals and data sheets to record measurements. The frequency of verbalization was recorded as a percentage using whole interval time sampling every 10 seconds during a 5-minute sample period within the 45-minute free play session. Observers recorded any verbalization using a T on the data sheet in the corresponding interval. If a verbalization carried over from one interval to another, both intervals would be marked with a T. Teacher attention was recorded during the same period of time and was marked with the teacher's initials in the corresponding interval. Only one observer measured the content of verbalization during the study. The measurements were conducted within the same portion of the year as the other frequency measures, but didn't necessarily take place on the same days. The observer wrote down everything the child said during a 15-minute sample period using event recording. The Observers simultaneously put a check mark in the corresponding column based on if the verbalization was directed toward a child or a teacher. Later nouns and verbs were counted, and if the child repeated the same noun or verb within the same sample, it would be counted as a repeat. Sentences were then categorized based on whether they were manned or non-manned. Product moment correlation coefficient was used to determine the inter-observer agreement for frequency of verbalization and teacher attention. With this method, values to determine the positive or negative correlation range from -1 to +1. -1 being the total negative correlation, 0 no correlation, and 1 total positive correlation. Measures were compared throughout the year, and a strong correlation is shown between all observers with the frequency of verbalization measurements. Comparable measurements of teacher attention also had a fairly strong correlation. On 2 separate occasions throughout the study, a second observer recorded content of verbalization simultaneously with the regular observer, and measurements were compared once again using the product moment correlation coefficients. Again, the scores showed a high correlation with regard to each other's measurements.
This study was a single subject design with one 4-year-old girl from a lower class community, and her family was stated to be extremely low income. Her IQ was slightly below average. The average is 79. She was at a 59 based on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. She was said to have very good motor skills and appeared to be well liked by others. Her target behavior of verbal behavior was marked to be very low. She would give appropriate answers in teaching situations if she spoke at all. Positive reinforcement was the main behavioral tactic. It was used during both intervention phases. Non-contingent reinforcement was used, so she was given praise and attention from her teacher regardless of the man she gave or the quality of her verbalization. In the first phase, she was required to answer questions regarding her mand. So if she manded for paint, the teacher would ask things like, what color? What do you need it for? What are you going to do with that? And she was required to answer before she would receive that tangible reinforcement. But the praise and attention were given non-contingently. The second behavioral tactic used was DRO reversal. So that is differential reinforcement for of zero responding. So this typically differential reinforcement means that you would differentially reinforce this desired behavior, but since this is a reversal, the reinforcement was given for every non-instance of the desired behavior. So if she was quiet, she was constantly reinforced with praise and attention from her teacher. If she had a verbalization, punishment procedures were implemented, and reinforcement was then removed for 15 to 30 seconds immediately after the verbalization.
Baseline data was collected for the first 129 days. Results indicated that of the 10-second intervals of each sample, it was found that verbalization and teacher's attention occurred for an average of 11%. Content of verbalization, which is the total number of nouns and verbs uttered per 15-minute sample, was 15, and different nouns and verbs was 7 on average. Frequency averaged at 7. In the treatment phase, the teacher's attention to the child was contingent on her verbalization and was maintained while she was talking. In addition, when the child demanded for materials, the teacher would provide attention through further probing questions. It was found that the child's frequency of verbalization increased from 11% to 75%, and the number of nouns and verbs increased from an average of 15 to 46. The number of different nouns and verbs used also increased from an average of 7 to 16, while the frequency of repetitions increased to an average of 30. During this phase, the number of verbalizations from the teacher to the child remained fairly constant at an average of 7.6 to 7.9. However, the verbalizations from the child to the teacher increased from 4.2 to 26.8. Non-man sentences, that are sentences that are not requests, remained approximately constant from an average of 2.3 to 2.6. However, the number of man sentences, that's requests, increased from 4.2 to 19.5. So what this indicates is that the greatest increase in frequency of verbalizations were almost entirely a function of an increase in mans to the teacher. And it was found that these increased requests involved more repetition of the same words. Since a higher frequency was seen in verbalization, it was necessary to see if the increase was due to the attention from the teacher or the contingency of presenting teacher attention immediately following child verbalization. So in order to test this, the experimenters used differential reinforcement of other behaviors, or otherwise known as DRO. This involved having the teacher's attention remain at the same high rate, but now was made contingent on the child not verbalizing. This demonstrated a decrease in rate of verbalization from an average of 46 to 6%. However, when teacher attention was reinstated to contingent upon verbalization, there was an increase in verbalization to an average of 51%. Using DRO also reduced the total number of nouns and verbs used to an average of 4 per day, and the amount of talking also decreased to the point that little verbalization was made to either teachers or the children. In this phase, using DRO demonstrated the function of the teacher's attention in maintaining the child's increased verbalization. Because the increased verbalization was mainly repeated requests to the teacher for materials, that means that the praise and social interaction of the teacher's attention is not the functional component to the child's verbalization. As per the findings in the DRO condition, the researchers felt it was necessary to manipulate the variables to see the function of the two components of each of teacher's attention. When they separated the teacher's attention to two components, they found that when the child was able to obtain materials she wanted without further questioning from the teacher, the frequency of her verbalization gradually decreased from 61 to 28%. And naturally, because the teacher only had to provide attention just as the child made a verbalization and no further questions, teacher attention also declined. The non-man sentences, repetitions of nouns and verbs, and verbalizations to other children remained about the same. Man sentences, on the other hand, repetitions of nouns and verbs, and verbalizations to teachers also decreased. When the teachers once again asked questions, the rate of verbalizations by the child increased from 29% to 67%. The number of repetitions of nouns and verbs and verbalizations to teachers and mans all increased to previous levels in which these conditions were present before. Communication is an integral part of functioning in society and gathering information. The present study aimed at increasing the verbal behavior of a child in a public school in a low-income neighborhood. Several observations in low-income neighborhoods in the public schools have found that children's verbalizations have relatively few descriptive and informative statements, but a large amount of commands and requests. The high frequency of requests may be due to the fact that material reinforcers are stronger than adult social interaction, and adults are seen as primary dispensers of material reinforcement. The child in this study had a higher frequency of requests. The majority of the requests were repetitions of the same nouns and verbs, which are similar to those findings of children from low-income families. Several studies have looked at remediating the effects of cultural deprivation and found that a relationship exists between teacher attention and child behavior. That is, teacher attention has been used as a strong reinforcer to modify and maintain appropriate behaviors of preschool children. This study also found a relationship between teacher attention and child vocalization. However, because the increased vocalization was mainly repeated requests to the teachers for materials, that meant that the praise and social interaction of the teacher's attention was not the functional component of the child's verbalization. Given the child was reinforced by tangible items and her verbalization showed increases with teacher probes prior to receiving the tangible item, the researchers felt that with time they would be able to increase the frequency and content of the child's verbalization using operant principles. Therefore, pairing the tangible item with the attention of the teacher could in turn condition the teacher's attention and function as a reinforcer when the tangible reinforcer was not present. It could be possible and definitely useful to adapt these procedures to other settings, including the home, with parent attention, especially if the dynamic of the low-income families is that there is little verbal interaction between parents and children. This would be a possible technique to teach parents in low-income families. In addition, this technique could also be used with very shy individuals, and that could be in various settings, schools or private clinics, etc.